Great. Good evening. Thank you for watching this virtual lecture event hosted by the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security and international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, and a new doctoral program. If you're interested in learning more about us, please visit iwp.edu. This evening, we'll be hearing from Mr. Jack Sacco. Mr. Sacco is the award-winning and Amazon #1 best-selling author of Where the Birds Never Sing and Above the Treetops. Originally from Birmingham, Alabama, he earned a degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Notre Dame. He is the winner of the Alabama Library Association's 2005 Author Award for Where the Birds Never Sing. Past winners of this prestigious award include Harper Lee for To Kill a Mockingbird and Walker Percy for The Second Coming. Where the Birds Never Sing is a nonfiction account of his father Joe Sacco's experiences during the Second World War, including his part in the liberation of the notorious Nazi concentration camp at Dachau. Mr. Sacco, welcome and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in, joining us. I want to share with everyone today an account of my father's experiences during World War II. When I was a boy, my father used to show me swords and medals and things that he had gotten during the war. I brought a couple of them. I have a couple of them with me. This one is a sword that he got at a Nazi officer's house at the very end of the war, and this was fascinating to see something like this as a kid. Here's another one that was a dagger that he had gotten and brought home after the war. So I would love seeing things like this. I'm going to show you some pictures, if I may, of some of the things that he would show me and some of the photographs that we have that I watched and looked at as I was a kid. Of course, this is the title of the book, the cover of the book that I wrote, Where the Birds Never Sing, which is the account of his experiences. But when I was a boy, these are his medals, and these were up on a wall, and I would see these, and just they were fascinating to me. In fact, I'm wearing one of his insignias on my lapel in honor of him. The If you look at these, you can see that on of course, there's a photograph of him. There's a cross, and there's an interesting story about the cross. He was raised an Italian Catholic, the only son of Italian immigrants, and this cross was given to him by his grandfather before he left to go to World War II. It was actually this cross originated with a priest up at the University of Notre Dame, where I ended up going to university. And he carried this with him throughout the war. So he wanted this to be prominent in his medals and memorabilia. On this slide, also you can see the picture of the insignia from the Third Army with the A with the circle around it. That was Patton's army. And one of the things here, I think, see if you can see the little pointer that I have. It's the French Croix de Guerre, and this was awarded to only a few American soldiers, I understand. So, and of course the combat infantry badge. But my father, I'm going to show you a few of these pictures so you could just get a sense of who he is and where he came from. This is a photograph of him just a few days before he received his notice to go into the army. He didn't really know what that meant and where. He had never been away from home. He told me that he was very scared to leave home. He didn't know anything outside of his immediate realm. Like many of the soldiers in World War II, he had never been away from home. This is a photograph of his first day in the U.S. Army. I asked him once. I said, "How did they end up taking this picture?" He said, "Well, they processed me. They swore me in. They put my uniform on, and they shaved my head." And he said they told me to go stand in front of that flag, and then they took a picture. And I said, "Well, you look a lot like Gomer Pyle in that picture." He laughed because he does look a lot like Gomer Pyle. And this was he was 18 years old here. So he he this is a photograph of a couple of days before D-Day, just outside of Oxford, England. Um, and the guys are getting ready. They don't know when they're going over. They don't know what's going on. But a man came to them. A general came and spoke to them the day before D-Day. And that man was General George Patton. Many of you may have seen the movie Patton, where at the beginning George C. Scott gets up and gives a talk, famous speech before an American flag. Well, it turns out my father was there. He was actually there when Patton gave that speech. He was actually right in the front. There were thousands upon thousands of American soldiers there. This happened the day before D-Day, and my father told me they cleaned it up for the movie as far as what Patton actually said. I contacted the Patton Society in America, and they sent me a transcript of Patton's actual speech. And so, because it's part of the story, and because it's part of my father's memories and experiences in the war, I included that speech in the book. And by the way, I speak in the book in the first person as if my father's telling the story. So it's an account of what it felt like, not only to be in the war, to leave home and all that, but what it felt like to sit in front of this man, to sit in front of General Patton, and hear that speech. And he told me that the soldiers were clapping and yelling and screaming and laughing, and Patton loved it. Patton loved them. They loved Patton, and he told me he really loved Patton. And Patton would come up with them on the front lines with them. A lot of the generals would stay back and hang back, and he would never see them. My father was in the 92nd Signal Battalion, and the Signal Battalion had an interesting job because they were supposed to go over on the first day of D-Day. They were supposed to go over on June 6th. General Hayslip, who was one of the generals who was in command, said he did not want the Signal Battalion, my father's unit, to go over on that day because he was afraid they would get killed, and then there would be no communications. The communications were vital. And so my father's group was held back for a few days, and they eventually landed at Omaha Beach. Omaha Beach was the first beach my father ever saw. Raised on a farm in Birmingham, Alabama, had never seen a beach, and this was the first beach he ever saw. So it was kind of a shocking event, and the war became very, very real. Life and death became very, very real to him at that point. He remembers. He told me he remembered seeing a boy, an American soldier, dead, and he my father crawled up to where he was and noticed his name tag, and the name tag said McCarthy. And he realized, he said, this McCarthy's mother doesn't even know that he's dead, but I do. And he realized the same thing could happen to them. And it became very, very real as far as life and death. He told me, he said, we were trained to fight, but we weren't trained to die. Dying takes it to another level. But they landed there. Interestingly enough, my father was under the command when he landed at Omaha Beach of General Teddy Roosevelt Jr., Theodore Roosevelt's son, who actually died a couple of days later of a heart attack. So being with the Signal Battalion, my father and his group would hook up communications for all of the other all the other soldiers and all the other generals. So here he is. My father's in the foreground here in this picture, with a buddy of his named Silverman in the background, and uh, they would string up the phone lines. They would be up in the trees, and they would, uh, like I say, string up the communications. They would, interestingly enough, they told me they would actually listen in to sometimes the communications between Patton and Eisenhower and Bradley and all these other guys, because this was the switchboard. They put up the lines. They had the switchboards, etc. So interestingly, they were telling me at one of the reunions I went to with my father and talked to his buddies and got to know them very well, and they were very open about their stories, and they told me everything. One of them who actually did operate the switchboard and listened in to a lot of the conversations, a guy named Mike Carapella, was an incredible man. He told me, he said, of conversations that he would listen into between Patton and Eisenhower. He told me that they didn't call up and say, "This is General Patton's, you know, assistant. We'd want to speak with, General Eisenhower. They had code names, and Patton's code name was Lucky Six. Eisenhower's code name was Itausa 2000. Itausa, European Theater of Operations, USA 2000. And I asked him, I said, "What can I put that in the book? Is that okay?" He said, "Yeah, it's declassified. We won the war, so it's over. So you can go ahead and put that in the book." One of the reasons I wanted to show you this picture of my father and his buddy Silverman, he was very close with Silverman. And um, like I say, my father had never been out of Birmingham, Alabama. Had never, he only knew his immediate group of people, which were the people he went to school with, and more importantly, his family, which was an Italian family that had come from Sicily. Mr. Silverman here was a Jewish jeweler from New York, and my father and he became very, very close. And there's a whole story of him in the book and their relationship. And but it's interesting because one time my father told me the story that they were up in some trees, just like you see here, and like I say, Patton would come up to the front lines and talk to them. He would tell them about things that he did during World War One, and he would ask them how they're doing and just chat with them. And like I said, my father loved that because a lot of the generals never came around. But there's a story about Patton coming up one day. Silverman, my father, and a few of his other buddies were up in the trees stringing some phone lines, and the infantry was down below them. And they saw a Jeep coming up with American flags and stars coming up, flying up to the front lines. And they watched, and the Jeep came to a screeching halt. Out stepped General Patton. And Patton looked up into the tree. He looked down at the infantry who were down below. And the infantry guys had been telling my father and his buddies, "You need to get down out of those trees. You're giving away our position." And the guys, my father and his buddies in the signal battalion said, "No, this is our job. This is what we're called to do. This is our job. We have to do this." So he said, Patton comes up. He looks down at the infantry guys who were down below. He looks up at my father and his buddies and says, he sort of gets their attention. He says, "Hey, soldier," looks up and actually gets Silverman's attention. And Silverman says, "Yes, sir." And he says, "What are you doing up there? Uh, what are you doing up there, soldier?" And Silverman said, "Sir, I'm stringing up the phone lines." And he says, "Okay." And he says, "Let me ask you something. From where you are, can you see the enemy? From where you are up there, can you see where the enemy is?" And Silverman looked out into the distance and said, "Yes, sir, I can see them. They're right over there. I can see them." And Patton said, "Well, don't they make you nervous? Don't they scare you?" And Silverman's quote was, he looked down and said, "No, General, they don't scare me, but you do." So, so these, Patton loved it. He laughed. He said, "Oh, these signal battalion guys are crazy SOBs." And he laughed. He got in his Jeep and took off again. But like I say, my father and his buddies, they loved General Patton. These are just some photographs of my father. This is actually in Germany, receiving a letter. Obviously, letters from home were, and my father signed his name here and all that. But letters from home were an incredible treasure. Uh, and this is a photograph at the bottom in France, just taking a break, having some wine. Um, One of the things my father would say a lot was he'd talk about the American soldiers and what they accomplished. And this is one of the things that I've always been very passionate about, especially in regard to the liberation of Dachau, in regard to the liberation of the Holocaust. Because as they went through Europe, my father said, he would tell me, "We looked after the little children." He said, "Thank God for the American soldiers." The quote that I have here, and this is in the book, he said, "Thank God for the American soldier. We did our best to look out for the little children. Whenever we would see them watching us in the chow line, we would each get a kid, put him or her in front of us, and give the child half of our mess kit. Captain told us we weren't supposed to do that because there might not be enough for all the military, but we didn't care. We loved these kids. They had gone through hell and really had nothing to do with the war. It made all of the guys feel good to see these kids eat, to do something kind and gentle, in contrast to the chaotic inhumanity surrounding us. I know it made me happy, and I believe it made God happy. me watching over the children while he watched over me. So this was the ethos of my father and his buddies in the American soldier. And I've always I was personally never in the military. My father was. My grandfather was actually in World War One. I was not, but I've always had great love, respect for the military because of the example that I saw with my father and the men that he served with in the Greatest Generation. And when you were with them, you knew there was greatness in the room, and so I I want to make sure that everybody understands who they are and what they were and what they meant for this country and what their memory and their example continues to mean for our great nation. Um, on Sunday, April 29th, 1945, they entered the Dachau concentration camp. Now, I was showing you these swords and daggers and things like that and medals that my father had shown me when I was a kid. But when I was about 12, one day he came to me with my mother and he said, I want to show you something that happened during the war. I assumed it was something like another medal or another sword or something. I was excited. And he said to me, he had a photo album and he said, I'm going to show you this that happened during the war. It happened at a concentration camp. I honestly, at that point, didn't know what a concentration camp was. I never heard of such a thing. So I asked him, I said, what's that? He said, well, the Nazis were killing people there, but we made them stop. And he said, I want to show you this. I want to show you these photographs for two reasons. One is that at some point in your life, someone is going to try to tell you that this didn't really happen. He said, it did happen. I was there and I saw it. It did happen. And he said, the other thing is, I want you to make sure that this never happens again, ever. I said, okay. And so he started showing me these photographs. And this is the front gate of Dachau. And they were horrendous. I mean, I'm not going to show those today, but they're some of them are in my book. And he had many that had never been obviously published or seen by anybody that he had taken. My father and his buddies had found a truck with cameras and German cameras and film a couple of days before they had entered Dachau at the very end of the war. This was, like I say, April 29th, 1945, which was right near the end of the war. So they had found these cameras and film, and so they just took them. And when they entered the camp, they realized that it would be important to start taking pictures of what they saw. My father was in the first 200 people to enter that camp, and they shut the camp down after the initial wave got in there. He told me that it only took about 20 minutes to take over the camp, for the American soldiers to take over the camp. Most of the regular Nazis or the regular German soldiers had left. A lot of them had already surrendered and left. The Nazi SS troops were left behind, and they were going to defend that place to the death. And honestly, they were going to try to kill as many people as they could. When my father and his buddies walked in, what they saw was unimaginable. These are men who had landed at Omaha Beach. These are men who had been through the Battle of the Bulge. My father had with the Signal Battalion, he was with or in front of the infantry at all times during the war. So he had witnessed almost every major battle during World War II, up close, personal, with bullets going around by him and people dying, and he had witnessed his own friends die. And yet, when he and his buddies walked into this camp, uh, they said that he said that he had never seen anything like this, and knew that he would never see anything like this again. It was the most horrendous thing. Grown men, a lot of these soldiers, combat hardened soldiers, were in tears. There is one point when he said that he went up to, there was the details of the liberation are in the book. Really strong details of everything that he saw and witnessed when they got there. But one of the things he saw, there were these cattle cars, and he said that he went up and walked and climbed up to the top of one of the cattle cars and looked down, and they were looking for anybody alive in these cars because there was death and destruction in these cars. Prisoners had been starved. The SS troops, like I say, were trying to kill all of the prisoners. They were trying to kill them all before the Americans got there. They knew the Americans were coming. I've spoken to people who were in the camp, who were prisoners in the camp, and I've also spoken to people who lived in the Dachau, in the city of Dachau. And the prisoners tell me that the soldiers, the SS, they wanted to kill everybody. And when my father and his buddies walked in, they saw death and destruction on a scale they could have never imagined. Women, children, babies, little boys, little girls killed, old people, elderly, starved, hate to say it, decapitated. Death was everywhere. Thousands upon thousands of people dying, dead. And like I say, there were cattle cars, and my father and his buddies climbed up. They were looking into the cattle cars. A lot of death down in there in this string of cattle cars, but they wanted to see if there was anybody alive. My father said that he looked down and he noticed, a note, and he's showing me photographs of all this while he's telling me. I'm not showing the photographs here because I just think they're too graphic. You can look at them in the book, but I don't want to broadcast them on here. But one of the photographs, there was bodies all in the bottom of one of these cars. My father noticed in the corner was a lady nursing a baby, and I asked him how old was the lady. He said she's probably about 22, 23. You have to remember, my father was 19 or 20 at this time. I think he had just turned 20. So he said that he saw this lady nursing a baby. Both of them were dead. To him, to my father, being raised, like I say, Italian Catholic, to him, this was symbolic of the Madonna and Child, a symbol of hope and life. And he told me that he felt like the lady was telling her baby son, he assumed it was a son. He said he felt like the lady was telling her, please hold on. I'm, giving the baby every last drop of life. Please hold on until the Americans can get here. My father said he saw that. He knew at that moment that was the most tragic thing he would ever see in his life, and that he actually started to weep. And he said that he felt his body shaking, and he started crying. And he said a prayer to God, and he asked that God would forgive him for not getting there sooner, for not being able to save, the lady and her baby. These are some of the prisoners that were rescued. Many of them were too weak to walk. A lot of them died even after the liberation. The American soldiers tried to give them food, but some of them died because they couldn't eat too much. And my father, who could speak Italian, he actually spoke Italian before he could speak English. So he actually translated. Some of the prisoners were Italians, and so he was able to translate and help them. They kept the prisoners segregated. They didn't just let them run free. They wanted to keep them safe. And these are some photographs of some of the prisoners after the liberation happened. My father said the following, which was very interesting to me. He said the prisoners had apparently not understood what was happening during the first 30 minutes or so after we took over the camp, but now they were beginning to realize that we were the good guys and they had been liberated. Some of them began yelling and shouting. The cheers of the few soon grew to become a deafening roar throughout the camp. These are the ones we save, I thought, as chills ran through my body. He told me it was very much, it sounded very much like being at a football game and your team just scored a touchdown and maybe won the game. And the crowd, that sound of a roaring crowd, he said it just got louder and louder. He said they were crowding together, reaching through the fences, wanting to touch us. They looked like the walking dead, just like the gentleman looked in the photograph before. He said like they were too frail to stand or reach or even smile. Yet in their parched voices, we heard jubilation, and in their sunken eyes, we saw the joyful glimmers of resurrected hope. They were laughing, crying, singing, holding their arms high in the air, embracing each other while looking at us in disbelief, almost unable to grasp that their day of liberation, their exodus, was at hand. Just then, as if on some celestial cue, the sun broke through the clouds, sending shafts of light and color over the entire camp. Darkness had been defeated by light, and the prisoners, squinting into that brilliance, reached out to us and wept tears of joy. Their agony was over, but for us, the liberators, our journey into this deepest part of hell was just beginning. The soldiers experienced for the next 24 hours, the camp, and they actually here's a photo of the boxcars that my father and his buddies found with bodies in it, and this is a photograph. I did an article. I wrote an article for USA Today magazine, and they chose a photograph. I'd never really seen this photograph. It wasn't one of my father's, but they chose a photograph for the front for the front cover of the article. And I noticed there was a soldier standing down here. You can see him circled in red, and it turns out that was my father. That's my father's in there, and he had talked about how the prisoners had reached through the gates and were calling for them and thanking the American soldiers and how grateful they look. And this is a very poignant photograph for me because my father had several other photographs. He had the same cigarette, pose with the cigarette hanging out of his mouth. He almost looked like he's about to start crying in this photograph. And this showed you the heart of my father, and I think of many of the American soldiers as they liberated, as they helped, as they freed the people and stopped. And one of the things that I've thought about that we don't think of that much is that the Holocaust stopped the minute the American soldiers got to the camp. It didn't stop because of a negotiation. It didn't stop because the Nazis had a change of heart. It didn't stop because they just ran out of people to kill. It stopped because the American soldiers got there. It stopped because the American soldiers got there. I've heard it said that peace is not necessarily the absence of war, but peace, in its truest sense, is the absence of fear. So my father and his buddies and the rest of the American soldiers who were there that day, they came to instill peace, to bring about order, and to eliminate fear that these people had lived in. One of the things that my father told me as he showed me the photographs, he said, the photographs that he showed me were horrendous, and I was looking at. He had told me, "Never let this happen again." I want you to know that this happened, which I could obviously see that it happened. He had pictures, and he was telling me. But he also said, "I want you to never let this happen again." I was wondering, as a 12-year-old, how could I prevent this from happening? It took the entire might of the American army to stop this. So how can I prevent this from happening? I came to later understand that one of the ways I could stop this from happening is to tell people about it, to bring awareness, to bring that truth to people, and to let them understand what really did happen, and to not allow them to change history. It is said that the victors write the history, and sometimes history becomes rewritten later on. It doesn't mean that the facts have changed. It just means there are new victors. People will come up and try to change it. Well, we will not. I will not let anybody change this history. This happened. And also the American soldiers stopped it, through their efforts, through their, leaving home and doing the things. One of the things my father said was the following, the meaning of their mission, which was very interesting to me. He said to me, we left Dachau later that morning, the next morning. They stayed there for about 24 hours. We left Dachau later that morning, having assisted the relief organizations in their efforts to bring some semblance of humanity back to this place that had endured so much tragedy and sorrow. Our hearts were burdened by what we had seen, but somehow lifted by the passionate gratitude of the liberated, who had blessed us with their joy and rewarded us with unexpected insights into what we'd achieved. Now, and this is the key, now, after a year of combat, each of us finally and forever understood why destiny had called us to travel so far from the land of our birth and to fight for people we did not know. And so it was here in this place, abandoned by God and accursed by men, that we came to discover the meaning of our mission. This is my father. A few days after the liberation. And, once again, you could see in his hand, cigarettes. The cigarette was there. My father had never smoked before he went into the army, but all the guys started smoking when they were there. The fact that they understood and in some ways were blessed by being part of the liberation, and they could actually see the people they saved, see the people that they liberated. There were tens of thousands of people saved that day. There are hundreds of thousands of people, if not even more, maybe more, several hundreds of thousands, who are alive today because these guys arrived at Dachau. They got there. And so children and families have been allowed to prosper. I've received many thanks personally as I go around the country and give talks. Very sincere people who are not only in the camp who were liberated, but the children and grandchildren of the people who were liberated who will thank me, and they'll say thank you for what your father has done. I appreciate that. And as my father, when he would meet people, my father passed away in 2007, but he did get to go with me around the country and meet a lot of people and speak with them. And he met a lot of those he had liberated. He had never seen them for the last 60 years. And now he had been able to be reunited after 60 odd years. And they would always, like I say, thank him. They would hug him. There would always be tears. And he would always ask them, "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" And he still felt protective of them. Interestingly, and I don't know if it's part of just the DNA or the way I was raised or whatever, but I still feel protective of them. I want to make sure that they're okay. And like my father said, I want to make sure by telling the truth of this Holocaust and bearing witness to that truth, that this does not happen again, that we do remember it, that we do understand that this really did happen. And because I've had people tell me it didn't happen. I've had people threaten me after I wrote my book. And as I go and give talks, I've had people threaten me, we're gonna harm you for lying about this. This never really happened. Well, I know that it happened. This picture, you see the picture of my father in his first day in the U.S. military, in the Army, and I say he looked like Gomer Pyle. This next picture was taken almost 2 years later. This was taken in Salzburg, Austria, about a week after the liberation of Dachau, and you can look at my father's eyes. There's something you can tell he has seen. He's witnessed something that is almost unimaginable. He told me he would, and look at the difference between those two. He told me that he would he would see new recruits, new members of the military command, new members of the infantry. They would be coming in. They would be fresh. They would be just out of training. They would be 18 years old. They would be marching up to the front lines, and my father would see them go past him. And he told his buddy once, Ed Duffy. He told Duffy. He said, look at these boys. A lot of them look like they've never shaved. They don't know anything. They're not trained. Duffy said, "Well, they've been trained by the military, just like you were." He said, "But they're just kids. They're going to get killed." And Duffy, my father's buddy, told him, "Joe, you're only 19 years old." You know, my father had said that he felt like he was 19 when he landed at Omaha Beach, and he felt like he was 35 by the time he got to the top of those cliffs. But this is what they went through. This is what they experienced. And he told me, he said that he thought that no one would ever be able to understand what he went through, which is another reason I wrote the book, so that people could understand and hear and 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 feel what he felt. This is a picture of my father on the left with a man named Max Steinmetz. Max lives in Birmingham, Alabama, which is where my father was raised. My father's family, his parents had come to America from Sicily, had gone to New York through Ellis Island, had ended up in Chicago. And just to tell you, one little background: my father's parents, both sets of grandparents, actually had ended up in Chicago from Sicily. And my grandfathers, who were kind of feisty, got in a fight with Al Capone, um, and they fled for their own safety and the safety of their family. They ended up leaving Chicago after some incidents that I won't get into here, but it's an interesting story. And they ended up in Birmingham, Alabama. So this is where my father parents had their farm, and where my father was raised. And so this is where I was raised. And this gentleman in this photograph with my father, they're reading the Stars and Stripes from the week of the liberation of Dachau. And this man is Max Steinmetz. He was a prisoner at Dachau, so he was one of the ones liberated. And so it was incredible to get to meet him. And this is a really incredible photograph of the two of them, and the bond that they had made on that Sunday morning in 1945. This is a photograph of me a few years ago. You can tell how young I look. And this is the man with me is Ambassador Georg von Hoenberg. Ambassador Hoenberg I met him. I was giving a speech, a lecture in Vienna, Austria. I was invited to give a lecture there. Not to name drop, but it's impossible not to name drop at this point, by the royal families, the Liechtensteins, the Luxembourgs, the Habsburgs, invited me to come and speak to them. Well, I spoke to them, and this gentleman, Georg von Hoenberg, was the grandson. Ambassador Hoenberg passed away recently, but he was the grandson of the Archduke Ferdinand. The grandson of the Archduke Ferdinand. Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophia were assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914, and that kicked off World War One. And so uh, I spoke to him a lot during the week. I got to know him very well. He was, and by the way, this photograph was taken. We went out for a sort of a walk around. I wouldn't call it a hike, but a walk around the castle one day where we were staying, and to visit with nature. And this, just so you see, these are his casual clothes, and those are my casual clothes. So you can sort of see the difference. But he would have, I suppose, he would have been the emperor had his grandfather not been assassinated in 1914. And I talked to him a lot about his grandfather and his grandparents at that point in time. He was telling me stories about Rasputin and all. Being around somebody like that who was involved in history, I wanted to just ask him questions. And so I peppered him with questions, and for a week. I stayed there for a week, and he was very congenial and wonderful, and we became friends. At the very end of the week, we were sitting around having tea, which happens, when you're with the royalty. Sometimes you have tea. They like tea, and don't we all? So I was having tea, and he was there, and the Princess of Liechtenstein, Prince of Liechtenstein, the Contessa, all of us were around the Habsburgs, and me, just like the grandson of peasants from Sicily, was sitting with the royalty, talking to them, and I realized, I said, what? This whole week I've been talking to. He had told me, you just call me Georg, but I couldn't call him Georg. I couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to do that. So he had just resigned from being the ambassador from Austria to the Vatican. So I decided to call him Mr. Ambassador. And so the ambassador said to me, I said, Mr. Ambassador, I was talking to you, and I've been asking you questions. You've been so patient with me, asking you about your grandparents this whole week, and over and over that part of history. I said, but I never asked you anything about your father. Can you tell me something about your father? Of all the things that he could have said to me about his father, about his whole father's life, he said to me one thing. He said, well, during World War II, my father was a prisoner at the concentration camp at Dachau. Now, I was there not to give a speech about Dachau, not to give a talk about Dachau. I was actually giving it a talk about something completely different, and I had never mentioned Dachau or history or my father or anything else during that week that I was there. But when when he said that, I said, Mr. Ambassador, do you know much about the liberation? And he said, yes. Sunday, April 29th, 1945. I said, well, there were only about 200 American soldiers, 250 or so American soldiers who liberated that camp that day. He said, I'm well aware of that. I told him, I said, well, my father was one of those American soldiers. When I said that, he stood up. He had his vest. He had his three-piece suit. He looked like he could have been the emperor. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. He walked. When he stood up, the princes of Liechtenstein, the princes of Luxembourg, the Contessa, everybody stood up. I didn't know what to do, so I stood up. And when I did, he walked across to me. He embraced me, and he said, "Please convey to your father my family's most sincere gratitude." And at that moment, I realized that this was a very, very big story. I mean, I had always thought that everybody's father liberated a concentration camp. Everybody's father landed at Omaha Beach. Everybody's father had seen General Patton give his speech. And it only occurred to me then that this didn't happen with everybody. This was sort of a very unique story. And interestingly enough, when I went to I had the idea to write the book. I didn't know any publishers. I didn't know anybody who. I'd never written a book. I'd read a book, but I'd never written one. And but I thought, how do you get a book? How do you write a book? How do you get it published? Because I knew I wanted to tell the story. My degree is in engineering from Notre Dame, but how do you write a book? So I thought, well, maybe I can do it. I mean, people do it, so why can't I do it? So people were telling me you need an agent, you need a literary agent in order to write the book. I didn't have a literary agent, so I went around looking for them. And when I did, literary agents kept telling me, well, nobody wants to hear about your father's experiences in World War II. Nobody cares. I told them that story about the ambassador. I said, this is a very unique story. This is a man who from humble beginnings touched lives across the globe. And it turns out that Princess Margaret of Luxembourg, who's a wonderful, wonderful person, her grandparents had also been at Dachau. And I said, there are thousands of people, including royalty, including the common man on the street, including the impoverished, who were there, who were liberated by my father and his buddies that day. This is a big story, and we've never heard the story of the liberators. We've never heard their story. We hear a lot about the Nazis, but we've never heard who these men were and how that day affected their lives. And agents, just so you know, agents were telling me, you know what, nobody cares. And maybe if you write something, just go ahead and write it, and maybe you'll sell a couple hundred copies. Maybe, I doubt it, but nobody's going to publish it. And just publish it yourself. And we've heard all the stories of World War II. And I said, you haven't heard this. You haven't heard this. And by the way, there's also a romance. There's also a romance in the book. My father meets a French girl. I wasn't going to really originally include it. My mother insisted that I include that story, so I did. And it's a lot of people's favorite part of the book. But you know, the agents kept telling me, nobody's going to read it. We're not going to help you get a publisher. So I started to realize one of the things I would do, I would think more like my father. I would think more like the American soldiers of World War II, more like the guys who landed at Omaha Beach and who liberated the Dachau concentration camp. I will not ask for permission to succeed. And I tell any young people, anything you want to do, and really anybody of any age, if you have something you want to do, you want to accomplish, as long as it's good, do it, accomplish it. Do not ask for permission to succeed. I was asking these agents for permission to succeed. They were telling me no. My loyalty to my father, to the photographs he had shown me, and to the charge he had given me years earlier was too strong. And I said, I cannot be dissuaded from this. I will tell his story. And so I decided to look another route. I contacted HarperCollins directly through a friend, and the HarperCollins called me and said, "This is an incredible story. We've never heard a story like this before. We would like to publish your book. What's it going to take?" And I said, "A contract." And they sent me the contract. I wrote the book. The book came out. The book was immediately on bestseller lists. The book was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. The book won several awards. I'm not just saying that to talk about myself. I'm saying it in regard to never take no for an answer when you want to do what's right. And also how happy it made me in the years before my father passed away, going around the country with it. You can see him pictured here with the book. He was very happy about the book. He was, just one thing quick. I'm going to wrap it up here, but he said to me, he said they should make a movie of it. And so he was out in Los Angeles once, and I was with him, and there were these girls, actresses, models, all these types. They were kind of swarming around my father, which they tended to do because why not? Look at him. And they were asking him one day. They said, "Mr. Sacco, who do you think should play you in the movie?" And he pointed to the cover of the book, and he said, "I don't know, but whoever he is, he better be good looking." So my father was very proud of the book, and I was very proud of him and what he accomplished. I will end this with just a quote, if I may, from General Patton. General Patton said the following, and I quote General Patton throughout the book, but Patton said the following about my father, about the other men in the Third Army. He said, "By God, I'm proud of these men. To me, it's a never-ending marvel what our soldiers can do. This war has made higher demands on courage and discipline than any war which I've known. But when you see men who have demonstrated courage and discipline, and they are killed or wounded, it naturally raises a lump in your throat, sometimes produces a tear in your eye. Back of us stretches a line of men whose acts of valor and self-sacrifice and of service have been the theme of song and story since before recorded history began. These are your fathers and grandfathers. These are the victors of war." And so, in conclusion, I just want to thank uh, the Institute for inviting me to be here. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us, for being here, and I would I'm very happy, if you have any questions to to take those at this time. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Sacco, for sharing that very interesting information. Just your father's account is very intriguing. And if you guys are interested, please check out this book. We do have a few questions coming in from our attendees. The first question, which I think is a very interesting question, did your father ever go back to visit the concentration camp after the war was over?
He did not. I did. I went and visited and got to know it. It was interesting. My father wanted to go back, and we actually wanted to go to, as a family, go to Normandy, and then go through all the places, and obviously go to Dachau. We were planning to do that. Unfortunately, my father got sick and passed away just before we could do that. So he did not get to do. He did not get to go. But when I went, it was an interesting experience because this is going to sound very strange, the way I'm going to phrase this. I actually, obviously, if many of you have been to Dachau, it's a somber experience when you walk in there. I named the book "Where the Birds Never Sing," but because you don't hear anything there, it's very quiet, and there's no talking or anything. It seems. When I went, I felt that, but I also, interestingly enough, I felt, this is going to sound strange, but I felt a sense of pride. Why? Because I knew my father was part of the solution. He was part of he had been there and stopped it. He had stopped that evil in its tracks that day, that minute. So my father didn't get to go, but I did on his behalf.
My next question for you is, in recounting your father's story, what did you find to be the most difficult part to write about or recount?
There were two main parts that were difficult. One was the liberation itself, because I wanted to go into really sort of excruciating detail. I remember when I was writing that part, I called him, and my mother answered the phone. And when she did, I said, "Oh, I'm writing the chapters on the liberation." She said, "How's it going?" I said, "It's okay." I said, I feel really bad." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because when I was when my father was 19, 18, 19, he went off to a war. He liberated people from the Holocaust. This is a big deal. I mean, this is a big deal in history." I said, "He did that. When I was 18, I went to the University of Notre Dame. We had maids in our dorms, okay?" We had maids in our dorm. I mean, I said, "I didn't do anything dangerous, and yet he did this." And it was nice. My mother said, "Look, he didn't have a choice, okay? He didn't have a choice. But you are called to write about it. You are called to let people know. So you have a part in that. The power of the story is in the telling of the story. And you have a part in what he did and what he accomplished. So you do your part." The other part that was difficult for me, and I think if anybody reads the book, they'll understand this, was when his friends were lost, when his friends died. There were moments when I knew it was happening. I had an outline. I knew when they were going to die, and I felt this sense of dread. And then I felt a sense of loss when they gone, because it took me a year to research, a year and a half to research and write the book. And I felt like I was almost in a time machine, Back to the Future with my father. I felt like I was hanging out with him as a young soldier. And so I would feel what he felt. I wanted to feel it, and I wanted the readers to feel it. So those parts were very difficult for me.
How has writing this book impacted your understanding of World War II and just liberation of concentration camps in general?
Well, number one, I became acutely aware of what it was like. One of the things that we think in terms of in regards to World War II, since we've seen movies and TV shows, etc., we tend to think in terms of a particular battle, and we also tend to think in general terms that we won. Yeah, we won that war, but in reality, these guys, these soldiers didn't know if they were going to win or lose. There was a point, and they were frightened. They were away from home. Like I say, many of them for the first time. As I said, my father, the first beach he ever saw was Omaha Beach. Most of these guys had never been away from home. They were school teachers and they worked at the drugstore and they were farm boys, etc., like my father. And and there were times, well, they obviously feared death, but there were times when they didn't know. They honestly they didn't have all the communications that we have now. So they didn't know what was happening a lot of times over that hill, over, they didn't know what was happening in the war. And there were times when they thought they had lost, like during the Battle of the Bulge, they didn't know if they thought maybe they had lost the war. And then the liberation itself, one of the things that became very clear to me, not only the reality of it and the depth of it, and I interviewed not only my father but his buddies and what they felt that day, and they would tear up. They would talk about Omaha Beach, and other battles, Battle of the Bulge, etc. They would just tell me sort of matter of factly what it was like when they would talk about the liberation. Even some 60 years later, they would tear up, and it was that day that changed everything for them. And so that understanding of the magnitude of the liberation of that day, and uh, of what they really saw and what they really experienced and how it changed them as people when they came back. Writing the book really brought it home to me, more than just the stories I'd heard growing up. When I put it all together, it really brought it home.
You mentioned that one of the purposes in writing this book was to make sure that something like this never happened again. So, how do you think we as a culture can remember our history and do our part in making sure that these atrocities don't happen again?
Well, one of the important aspects of that is to understand that it did happen, to acknowledge that it did happen. Like I say, there are people, and they can be very vocal and they can be very violent sometimes. Like I said, I've had people threaten me, telling me it did not happen, and so to understand that it did happen, and also to understand how these types of things happen. These types of things happen because people are marginalized, and it's easy to do. Marginalizing, it sounds like it's a really bad thing, but it's also a very easy thing to do, to marginalize people. We all tend to do it, whether we want to admit it or not. We all kind of marginalize other people, other groups, other sports teams, so we just kind of do that as part of people, who we are as people. But we never tend to marginalize ourselves. It's always somebody else. We don't like the way they look. We don't like the way they, their skin color. We don't like how tall they are. We don't like their hair color. We don't like what they think or believe or whatever. And 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 so we have to be, number one, careful of that. My